Today we're going to talk about another linkage institution, which is elections. And so we're going to look at voting as an activity that people do and try to figure out all the reasons why people decide to vote or why they don't vote. We want to look at when they vote and when they don't vote, and we want to look at who decides to vote and who decides not to vote. Our objective today, we want to make sure we can describe the role of voting. We want to find out how people vote and all this kind of stuff. We want to find out when and who is voting. We want to be able to use that to explain how elections link people to the government. This is probably our most obvious of the linkage institutions, but we still got to explain how these institutions of elections, how elections serve to link the people to the government. So today we're going to look at why do people decide to vote. First up, we're going to take a look at some data and some patterns to see which people are voting. We're going to break people down by demographics, find out which groups are most likely to vote, and we're also going to talk about reasons why people choose to vote or choose not to vote. First of all, let's deal with voting. This is the most obvious of the linkage institutions. It is like a clear connection between the people and the government. This is this is an institution. This is a thing that we expect to happen all the time here in the government. We expect for people to specifically be allowed to express what they want the government to be. Elections tend to be an opportunity for people to decide who the government is. So almost all of our elections are situations where we are choosing people to serve in our government. But there are some elections, like on the state and local level, where people are allowed to express their preference for what the government does. So states and local governments may have referendums, and that's where people are voting yes or no on a specific law. But these are connections where people are expressing their preference for who the government is or what the government does. And this is obviously the most important thing in a democracy. In a democracy, if the people have the power over the government, they need to be able to express their preference for who's in charge and what the government's doing. It's important in democracy that people have the right to express their preference, and it's also important that people have the freedom and the right to choose not to participate. So we're just going to go through some data here from previous presidential elections, and this is from 2016, which was a more normal election than the 2020 election. But in 2016, we had women voting at a higher rate than men. Women are a little more likely to exercise their right to vote than men are. Women are a little more likely to vote. They're a little more likely to participate in other ways as well, thinking about participating in things like protest or donating money to candidates or causes and things like that. So women are a little more engaged than men politically. Age is one of those demographics that we think has obvious patterns. These are things that you guys tend to know before you get to class, but older people are way more likely to exercise their right to vote than younger people. Older people are more likely to participate in lots of other ways. They will join political parties. They'll donate money to campaigns. They will contact their lawmakers, they'll contact congressmen and things like that. So old people are definitely likely to be involved. Here we see, that's almost 3/4 of the population between ages 50 and 75. And then down when we look at young people, we're from the age under 24, we're talking about less than half of the population turning out to vote. This pattern has been true for a long time. Here we can trace this back to the 80s, and there are moments when turnout gets a little higher, especially for young people, but they're still the lowest group likely to participate. We see here that they never quite get to half of young people choosing to participate in elections, at least in voter turnout. So we see as age goes up, people are more likely to decide to exercise their right to vote. Married people are more likely to exercise their right to vote than people who are in different situations. So the married people tend to have a turnout of about 70%. That's usually just married partners tend to encourage each other to vote, hold each other accountable for voting, or just remind each other that it's election day. When people don't have those permanent connections, they're slightly less likely to go out and vote. So marriage is a thing that encourages people, those people are more likely to exercise their right to vote than unmarried people. Income is another one of those motivators. Income, we see in our patterns here that wealthier people are more likely to exercise their right to vote with people with lower incomes. The higher people's income becomes, the more likely they are to turn out to vote. These people have a lot of stake in the system. They probably have a lot of policy preferences about different things that they want to happen or things that they want to happen to their taxes or whatever. But people with higher incomes are more likely to exercise their right to vote than people with lower incomes. People who are employed are way more likely to exercise their right to vote than people without jobs. Here we see the turnout of people with jobs is almost 2/3. It's a little over half for people who are unemployed. And this is probably, the same thing is like a marriage. These people, see other people every day. People with jobs may be encouraged by their job, may be reminded by their job to go and vote. But people with jobs more likely to exercise their right to vote than people without. And another thing that separates here is education. So people with college degrees are way more likely to exercise their right to vote than people with less education. So we can see some breakdown here. People with a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree, 4 out of 5 of them are showing up to vote, whereas people that didn't finish high school, only about half of them vote. People that have graduated high school, that's a little higher, but it's a big separation from people with college education and people without college education. So education, definitely one of those things that causes people to get out and vote. Race is another demographic that we'll track. In general, and because it's what our textbook would say over time, voter turnout is higher among white people than it is among minority groups. So that's just that's a textbook fact that we want to use. However, that is changing. So what you can see here in 2008 and 2012, those are both the Obama elections. African American voter turnout was actually higher as a percentage of the population than among white people. And that is a big deal because once that pattern happens, once policymakers see that African Americans will sometimes vote at higher rates than white Americans, then they're more likely to cater campaigns based on that fact. And so in the 2016 and in the 2020 elections, there were a lot of new efforts made to reach out and to encourage black voters because their voter turnout had been so high in the 2008 and 2012 elections. We see efforts made by campaigns to try to attract black voters more purposefully than they had before. And so that's a big deal when data like that, when we see data like that, we see changes in the behavior of campaigns. For Hispanic voters, that's a much lower turnout rate, and for other racial groups, that is a lower turnout rate. But we'll see if campaigns begin to try to use some of those same tactics to encourage those voters to show up and turn out as well. And this one doesn't have anything to do with the voters, but has to do with what's going on in the election. So it's important that we understand the difference between presidential elections and midterm elections. The presidential election, like in the year 2020, is when we have presidential candidates trying to run to be the president. A midterm election occurs in the middle of their term. So there was one in 2018 or one in 2022. And the only thing up for national election there is members of Congress. So the whole House of Representatives and a third of the Senate. So here we see that the voter turnout for all groups is a lot higher in presidential elections. So that would be represented by the green bars here. The orange bars is the congressional elections, and those are much, much lower turnout elections. So presidential elections can get really high turnout, close to about 60% typically, and midterm elections have much lower turnout that ends up being half of voters turning out for a midterm election is really good, but it's usually less than half. So there's a lot less voter excitement for midterm congressional elections. When we think about voters, we need to make sure we think about why they are making the choice that they make. What is it that causes a voter to vote for Donald Trump or to vote for Joe Biden? What is it that causes a voter to vote Democrat or a Republican? whatever. So these are some ways that we categorize the choices voters make. The first two are really obvious here. We have policy voting, where a voter is voting based on a candidate's policy preference. So if I am mostly concerned with protecting the environment and one candidate has a good plan for fighting climate change, I'll vote for that candidate. Probably the most common form of voting is partisan voting, where we vote based on the candidate's political party. So as a voter, if I am a Democrat, I'm going to vote for whichever person is the Democrat. If I am a Republican, I'm going to vote for whichever candidate is the Republican. I don't pay much attention to anything other than their party affiliation. So policy voting based on policies, partisan voting based on the candidate's party. What had become more common here in recent elections is what we call candidate evaluation voting. This is where the vote is cast based on what type of person the candidate appears to be. So we'll be looking at the candidates, like, what's their value system? Are they religious, or do they have like a job background that you respect? Are there a lot of scandals involved with the candidate? Does the candidate appear to be telling the truth? Is the candidate tough or intellectual? But we're all making value judgments on the candidates themselves that don't really have much to do with their policies and don't really have a lot to do with their party. We'll see in some exit polls where voters are asked, like, is a candidate trustworthy, or are they likable? Those kind of things. So all that fits into candidate evaluation voting. We've also got pocketbook voting. This is where a voter casts their vote based on their own personal economic situation. So from the year, you would think about what's going on and how that's impacting you and your family's economic situation. So like currently, the Democrats have a lot of control of the government. So in this time, if like my income increases, if my investments generate good return, if like the price of goods remains low, I'm probably going to continue to vote for Democrats, because while the Democrats run things, my personal economic situation is good. Think about the last year of President Trump's time in office, if people had been having a good economic situation and all of a sudden they lost their job, or they were unable to work, or their investments lost money and things like that, then people would vote for a different party to take over and run the government. So pocketbook voting doesn't pay a ton of attention to the candidates, but does think a lot about the person's own economic situation. And retrospective voting is where candidates voters look back on candidates that are there and try to decide what that candidate has done for them. So this applies mostly to a person who's in office. So as Biden is president now, and we look back on Biden in 2024, voters will think about, has this candidate done good things for me? And if so, they'll vote for Biden again. And if not, they'll vote for a change. It's also important for us to make sure that we understand reasons why people choose not to vote. So it's really important that we equally think about reasons why people don't vote, because the people that don't vote are potential votes that candidates aren't getting. So the main reason here, the main thing we want to pay attention to, is just people are not interested. There's voter apathy. They don't care about the candidates. They don't pay attention to politics. They don't think the government impacts them or anything. So that's our biggest reason. It's just people don't care. Okay, so that's the main thing we want to think about. But there are other problems as well. One reason people don't vote is that registration can be difficult. You have to register to vote all the time. You have to update your registration when you move. You have to register a certain time in advance of the election in some places. And so there are people that want to vote, but find out that they're not registered to vote and it's too late. So that's one reason why people don't show up to vote. We also have a lot of people who think that their vote won't matter, it won't change anything. People think that, the politicians aren't speaking to them anyway. This is especially true of young people. So, they don't like either party or either candidate. They don't think anything will change in the government, so they don't vote at all. Related, people might think that their vote doesn't count. They may not trust the election system. They may think that their vote in their particular state is like too overwhelming in favor of Republicans or Democrats. So people think that their vote doesn't count and they decide not to vote in an election. And another thing is people don't vote in local elections or midterm elections. We have a lot of people who pay attention to elections for the president, but don't really pay attention to any of those other elections. We saw that in our data, how voter turnout is much lower in those midterm elections. This last one here is just a vocabulary term that's kind of weird, but that we'll see sometimes. So when we see the term ballot fatigue, we're just talking about people being sick of voting. There's elections all the time. There are, federal elections every 2 years. Often local governments have their elections in odd numbered years. So there's like an election every year. There's primaries before the election. People just get sick of it and stop participating. All right, so we have taken a look at voter turnout data, and we've kind of broken people down by demographic groups so we can see which groups are more likely to participate and which ones aren't. We're going to take a deeper look at that, and we also want to start to associate particular groups with liberal and conservative ideology. So we'll be able to decide not only will they vote, but how they will vote.